Well, hey, hi everybody. Back again with discussion number 2, a lecture I want to include with that. Hope everybody had a great holiday season and you're all fired up to get ready to come back to class and work real hard together. This is probably my favorite discussion out of what I've seen here, and that is just comparing the different philosophies, or you could even say more simply types of corrections. And then we'll go down the line. I'll just mention them to you, and then you can maybe make a page for each and take some notes, and you may want to augment what I talk about with some additional research and so forth. I think that it's very good to do some reading and some research and so forth before you start typing your discussion board posts. It's good to be a little better grounded in just what we're talking about each week. So on this one, this is discussion number 2, and we're talking about deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, retribution, and restoration. And so if you make a kind of a page for each, I'm going to start with deterrence. Let me first say that I am no big fan of deterrence. I really don't think that it works that well. But the other point that we need to understand about deterrence is that there's 2 types of deterrence at least, and the 2 that I'm thinking of is specific deterrence and general deterrence. And specific deterrence is the deterrence on the individual when they are sent to prison. So in other words, if a single person is punished for a certain kind of an act, that's probably the most effective type of deterrence. Where I think we get into trouble is a lot of politicians especially want to say, well, we'll make an example out of somebody and we'll send them to prison for like ever for dealing drugs, and then that will deter all their little friends. Well, it doesn't really work like that. The problem is that so many people that are of a criminal mentality are very impulsive. They are very unable to think ahead, plan past the minute that they're in right now. You know, they're living in the moment, they say, and that can really be a difficulty for a person. So especially general deterrence, I just don't find that it's very effective. In fact, I've posted a reading for you to look at from the National Institute of Justice, and they said that maybe imprisonment can have the reverse effect. Rather than cause someone to be deterred from engaging in crime, it actually makes them a better criminal because they get around other criminals and they compare notes, and one thing leads to another, and maybe they develop new skills, or they develop a new crew is what they call it, and so they're more effective as a criminal. So deterrence generally not that effective in my experience. Now there's other people out there that are going to argue that deterrence is effective, but I really think what they're talking about more so than deterrence is what we call incapacitation. And so moving on into incapacitation is basically just taking them off the streets. In other words, warehousing people. In other words, as long as they're locked up, they're not able to commit another burglary. And burglary is a big one to look at in terms of penology, because studies have been done on burglary, and I've read some, and some of the ones that I've read indicate that for every 25 burglaries that a burglar commits, they get caught one time. So stop and think about it. There is a certain value in incapacitation if we know that burglars are breaking into 25 homes in a year. That's what it was, 25 homes in a year. Now, in 25 homes in a year, and then they get arrested, they go to jail for, what, 5, 10 years, then 25 homes a year, 25 homes a year, 25 homes a year, till they get arrested again. So, there is some value of just taking people like this off the street, because fewer people lose their goods. This costs millions of dollars a year. If we're talking 25 times thousands of burglars. Burglars are some of the most prolific criminals that we have. They actually have a certain culture that they believe that what they're doing is really right and fair, and they're almost impenetrable as far as someone that wants to rehabilitate them or try to use some other means to get them involved in the system and straightened out. And a lot of that is because it's a culture in a family that everybody does it in their upbringing. They're just used to it. They think they have a right to more or less help themselves. And so when we're studying incapacitation, burglary is probably a really good example. Now, we've looked at statistics before, and murder is probably the lowest likelihood that a person will commit another murder or another crime of any kind. Murder, very unlikely. It's about 5%. So you might ask yourself, well, why do we put people away so long for murder? And that's because of scale. We have to find a significant punishment for taking someone's life. Now, the death penalty is another alternative, and that would fit under the definition of incapacitation. So here again are just some of my thoughts on these things, and that you might be able to use those, but you might want to follow up on your own and do your own research and develop your own thinking. And there's nothing wrong with different ideas when it comes to these type things. We're all here to share, and there are many people in our class that have a lot of good experience that they can bring to the table. So don't hesitate to disagree with me. And that's what it's all about, really. But on the other hand, at least consider some of the things. I hope you will, because I have like 40 years of experience, so I would think that at least it's something to think about. So anyway, as we move along then, I think incapacitation has a certain value, but it's probably overstated, and it's very expensive, very expensive. So that's the downside on incapacitation. I think for certain criminals and certain crimes it's very effective, but there's a lot of cost involved. So we have to stop and think, about who we're going to put into prison. And the question on that is, what is burglary? Is burglary considered a crime of violence? Well, it can be, and I really think that it should be considered as a crime of violence, because burglary itself, it's not about the stealing. It's about, invading somebody's private space. Their home is their castle. And we look at that very strongly in this country. And so when someone gets so close to a person, especially when you think that person could be, let's say, a female, and she's attacked by a burglar, and it's a burglary because the guy breaks in to perform a rape. Well, that's a burglary. That's a form of a burglary. So when we say burglary, it can either be robbery, it can be theft, it can be rape, it can be arson, vandalism, a number of different things. So we have to be pretty careful when we're thinking about using incapacitation for only violent offenses, because where do we draw the line on violence? But that's comes into play as we get into the next thing, which is rehabilitation. I'm in favor of rehabilitation in a lot of cases. I think that it does work. One of the things we need to understand, just a couple real quick statistics. Why do we need rehabilitation in prison? Over 50% of the people in prison in the United States cannot read and write. They don't have the skills to go straight. A large number of people in prison today have mental problems. A large number of people today in prison have substance abuse problems. Untreated substance abuse problems will just go kind of into hibernation. But if you don't really work on programs in terms of rehabilitation, then basically the question then becomes, what's going to happen when the person gets back out? Basically, if you haven't worked on making any kind of changes in their thinking, then they're going to be right back at it, and they'll be right back engaged in substance abuse or other kinds of problems that they have, including fighting, domestic violence, and these type of things. So the time should be used effectively if they're going to be in prison. But an argument can be made by others that, people can stay at home and engage in community corrections, which is a form of rehabilitation that you can do from home. What would be the value of that? Well, it's a tremendous savings, because you're not paying for the person's meals, you're not paying for the person's housing, you're not paying to have somebody stand and watch over them day and night. And so rehabilitation has a lot of advantages when it comes to the cost. But here again, I think we're getting into a thing where we're having to do some hair splitting about who gets what. And this is where we're going to talk later on about classification, who should get what type. Because we're saying that none of these things are necessarily exclusive of the others. Certain things maybe should be engaged in incapacitation for the the benefits of keeping violent offenders off the street. Other type of offenders should be engaged in rehabilitation. Maybe if they learn to read and write, learn some job skills, learn to stop over using alcohol, and stop using drugs altogether, that they could be productive citizens. And it's money well invested if we're helping people to better themselves and get out of a life of crime. So that's a story about rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, there's a lot more to it than doing a few classes while you're in prison. That's one part of it. But there's a much bigger part of it that's involved in, going to treatment. We've been involved a few times with child molesters, for example, and we have a class for them here where I volunteer called Thinking for a Change. Well, in addition to that, they have to go to psychotherapy. They have to have a lie detector test every month, and so then they have to pay for all this. They have to have a job, they have to pay their own way. This is when they're on parole here in Indiana where I work. But the thing is, if they mess up at all, they're going right back to prison. And so it's a good combination of use of rehabilitative kinds of functions, but with incapacitation hanging over their head, that they're going to go back if they don't get it together. Well, the fourth type of programming that we want to talk about is what we call retribution. Now, generally, I call it retribution is basically a get-even program. So in other words, the state acting more or less for the victim is going to get even with the with the defendant. Now, there's a wide range of types of retribution out there. Retribution can be involved in some of these programs like even fines and restitution, but it can also be more like in the area of the death penalty. So in other words, where retributive type of programs are, if you took a life, then you're going to have to pay with your own life. So it's kind of an eye for an eye approach. So it's pretty ancient type of system.